What if I told you that hidden within the golden age of the Islamic Caliphates lies a history so complex, so controversial, that most people today have never heard it, or would rather pretend it never happened? From the courts of powerful caliphs to the intimate verses of forbidden poetry, same-sex love and desire quietly shaped art politics and even power itself in ways that defy the stories we're usually told. This isn't the history you'll find in school textbooks. It's layered, surprising, and sometimes scandalous. Before we dive in, comment what time it is where you're watching from. I love seeing where in the world our history community is tuning in. And if you enjoy uncovering the sides of history they don't want you to see, you might consider subscribing. No pressure, but we go deep here. Shall we begin? You find yourself in the Baghdad of the early Abbasid era, and the first thing that strikes you, besides the sheer dustiness of the streets, is the variety of humanity brushing past you. Here's a soldier in lacquered armor, with his helmet under one arm. There's a scholar holding a scroll to his chest, as if it's a newborn, and right in front of you, a young man with coal-lined eyes and robes so finely embroidered, you wonder if he's on his way to a poetry recital or a costume contest. The caliphate at this time is at the height of its wealth and curiosity and social rules, while there seem to flex in interesting ways. You might have expected stern sermons and rigid discipline at every street corner. But instead, you hear music drifting from courtyards and laughter from shaded balconies. It's a place where formality and indulgence dance together, like partners who know each other's steps too well to pretend otherwise. Step into the court itself, and you quickly realize the openness here is not an accident. The Abbasid caliphs, especially in their early centuries, have a taste for display, and the display includes people. The court is a living stage where beauty, charm, and wit are valuable currencies, and nobody pretends they're not. You see male and female performers alike, each prized for a particular talent: the perfect quip, the haunting song, the glance that could stop a vizier mid-sentence. It's a far cry from the simplified image of strict and monolithic Islam that later centuries will often project backward. The political power here is absolute, yes, but the social atmosphere, especially in elite circles, leans toward permissive, at least as long as you keep it within the palace walls and under the caliph's amused gaze. Even the literature pouring out of Baghdad reflects this openness. Calligraphers and poets don't shy away from themes of same-gender affection. They wrap it in metaphor, sure, but the imagery isn't hard to decode. You notice how the verses blend admiration for beauty with clever wordplay, turning desire into a kind of intellectual sport. Think of it like a sophisticated dinner party game, except instead of guessing who killed Colonel Mustard, you're trying to outdo each other in describing the curve of someone's eyebrow without getting too obvious. The court audience eats it up, and so does the caliph, who has the power to reward a well-turned phrase with gold or an estate. This atmosphere isn't limited to the palace. In the city's markets, you hear snatches of the same themes in street songs and tavern jokes, though cruder, less polished. Tavern owners hire musicians who can slip risque verses between love ballads, and patrons laugh into their cups pretending to be shocked. It's a kind of open secret that taste travels down from the top. When the rulers indulge in certain pastimes, the rest of the city feels freer to echo them, even if in parody. The tension between public virtue and private indulgence exists, but the early Abbasid period has a knack for keeping both in play without letting one choke the other. Walking past the palace gates one afternoon, you catch sight of an entourage returning from a hunt, horses sweating falcons, hooded servants trailing behind. Among them is a favored courtier, his robe still bright, despite the dust leaning toward the caliph, with a grin that seems too personal for mere politics. It's these subtle, unspoken cues that tell you more than any dusty scroll could in this world. Proximity to power is often tied to personal appeal, and personal appeal doesn't always follow the neat boundaries of propriety. If you've ever watched a modern political leader surrounded by an inner circle that seems more like a clique of college friends than an official staff, you can picture the dynamic here, except with more silk, more poetry, and definitely more incense. The merchants gossip about these favorites in the same tone people use today when discussing celebrity couples. They speculate on who is in favor this season, who might be fading, who's been given a new house along the river as a sign of affection. They don't use the word scandal lightly, but they know that the palace thrives on relationships that are as much about chemistry as about governance. The caliph may be the head of state, but he's also the center of a courtly culture that sees pleasure as part of the art of ruling. And you notice something else, the absence of the kind of public moral panic you might expect in a more tightly policed society. There are theologians, of course, and not all of them approve, but in this early phase, their disapproval hasn't hardened into full-scale suppression. It's still possible for someone to write a suggestive poem and have it read aloud without the room freezing. It's still possible for a favorite to walk openly beside the caliph without whispers becoming shouts. You get the feeling you're looking at a rare balance point in history before political necessity or religious pressure forces a clampdown, and while the empire's self-confidence is strong enough to tolerate a little flamboyance. Even the architecture seems to encourage it. The palace gardens are full of hidden alcoves and shaded pavilions, places built for conversation that might turn into something more. Water channels trickle past rose bushes. The air is heavy with jasmine, and somewhere behind a carved wooden screen, you hear a soft laugh. You think about how space shapes behavior, how a modern open-plan office changes the way people interact for better or worse, and you realize the Abbasid court is designed for intimacy, whether intellectual, political, or personal. Here, beauty is not just appreciated, it's engineered into the environment. You drift deeper into the city's literary quarter, where the air smells faintly of ink-oiled parchment and the sesame-scented bread from a nearby stall. Here, in small shaded rooms or sprawling courtyards, poets gather to recite verses that flutter between outright audacity and clever restraint. You find yourself at one of these gatherings, sitting on a worn carpet, leaning back on a cushion that looks like it's seen better dynasties. A young man in a turban leans forward to read his voice, lilting each line a blend of wit and longing. He's quoting Abu Nuwas Baghdad's most infamous poet, whose name alone can make an audience smirk before the first couplet leaves the reader's lips. Abu Nuwas doesn't bother with subtlety. His verses praise beauty with a frankness that would make a courtier cough politely today. He sings of wine of love between men, of the sheer joy of defying stuffy moralists. You can almost see him in your mind, sharp eyes, sharper tongue, taking aim at hypocrisy as easily as he celebrates the curve of a shoulder or the gleam of a smile. His work is not tucked away in secret. It's recited aloud in public spaces, copied by scribes, and passed hand to hand like a favorite joke. You realize you're listening to poetry that isn't just personal expression. It's cultural rebellion disguised as entertainment. And Abu Nuwas isn't alone. There's Walibah ibn al-Hubab, known for verses so finely tuned they can balance affection humor and challenge in a single breath. There's Bashar ibn Burd, the blind poet, whose sharp satire could slice through arrogance as neatly as a court chef fillets fish. These figures write in a style that doesn't always hide behind metaphor. When they do, the imagery is so lush, comparing beloveds to gazelles' moonlight or rippling water, that it's more ornament than concealment. The audience understands every layer, and they relish the game. It's the kind of cultural code you might compare to a double meaning in a modern pop song, one that sounds innocent enough to pass the censors, but everyone nods knowingly at the real intent. There's a casual boldness to these poets that feels almost cinematic. Imagine someone today delivering a cheeky monologue on live television in front of a politician who's supposed to disapprove only for that politician to be laughing along. That's the dynamic here. Caliphs, viziers, and high officials sometimes act as patrons offering rewards to poets whose words please them, even if those words flirt with boundaries. It's as though the act of skillfully bending the rules proves you're clever enough to deserve a place at the table. The language of these poems, even when translated, still has a rhythm that's hard to forget. You catch how repetition, wordplay, and musical phrasing work together to draw the listener in. In a way, it's not far from a stand-up set. Timing matters, and the payoff has to land just right. Only instead of a microphone and spotlight, there's a carved wooden lectern and the flicker of oil lamps casting shadows on the plaster walls. The performance is part of the point. A verse read silently on a page can charm you, but one delivered aloud with the right pauses and emphasis can bring a whole courtyard to life. Of course, not everyone is clapping. You overhear a scholar at the edge of the crowd muttering about moral decay, quoting scripture under his breath. He's ignored for now, but you can sense the tension. Art that pushes boundaries will always have critics waiting in the wings. And in a city like Baghdad, where political fortunes can change overnight, the line between celebrated and censored can be alarmingly thin. It's part of what gives these gatherings their electric undercurrent. Will this verse be remembered for centuries, or will it be the one that finally provokes the wrong person? You lean back, letting the voices wash over you. The words are full of sunlight and shadow, a mixture of joy and risk. They're not just talking about beauty. They're challenging the idea of who gets to define it and why. There's something timeless about that question, isn't there? You can picture any number of artists in any century wrestling with the same push and pull between expression and expectation. And here in the Abbasid world, that wrestling match is carried out in rhyme and meter, over cups of wine and the occasional raised eyebrow from the corner of the room. The crowd shifts as a new reader takes the floor, someone younger, perhaps hoping to earn a patron. His style is different, more coy, more layers of metaphor, but the theme is unmistakable. You notice how the audience responds, murmuring approval at well-placed allusions, laughing softly at a particularly daring turn of phrase. It's a kind of collective performance. The poet offers the bait, the listeners bite, and together they weave a moment of shared complicity. Nobody says out loud what they all understand, and that's half the fun. Outside, the streets are dark, now lit only by the glow from shop fronts and the occasional torch. You step away from the courtyard, still hearing the echo of rhymes in your head, and realize this isn't just entertainment. It's a reminder that culture thrives when people are allowed to say the unsayable even if only in carefully chosen words. Morning comes with the muted clang of merchants lifting shop shutters, and you find yourself drawn toward a quieter corner of the city where artists and musicians cluster. Here, the talk isn't about politics or theology, but about an aesthetic ideal that seems to have wrapped the Abbasid imagination in silk the boy gazelle. It's a term you hear murmured in poetry and painted in metaphor, a shorthand for youthful beauty that blurs the line between human grace and animal elegance. The comparison isn't meant to be literal. No one's sticking antlers on anyone, but the gazelle's big luminous eyes, its quick fluid movements, and that alert, almost shy demeanor become a cultural archetype. You see it in miniature paintings, where a favored court page is rendered with impossibly fine features, head slightly tilted as if caught in a private thought. You hear it in songs drifting from a lute player under a fig tree, the melody winding through verses that praise not just appearance, but the whole manner of being light swift, almost untouchable. It's a beauty that doesn't promise permanence, and maybe that's part of the allure. Like a gazelle on the edge of a meadow, it could vanish in a heartbeat. The poets milk that tension for all it's worth. In a workshop near the river, an artisan shows you a series of ceramic tiles, each painted with a figure in flowing robes, hair falling over one shoulder, the pose deliberately ambiguous. You ask about the inspiration, and he smiles, tapping one tile. It's about a way of seeing, he says, not just about the person. It's a reminder that beauty, like the gazelle, belongs to no one. You get the sense that he's speaking as much to himself as to you. It's a gentle philosophy wrapped in art and metaphor, and it slips easily past the kind of moral scrutiny that might have bristled at more direct expression. This ideal isn't confined to Baghdad. You hear travelers from Damascus and Cairo carrying similar imagery describing court favorites or local performers in the same breathless terms. Even far-off Samarkand, with its Persian-tinged culture, trades in the gazelle metaphor. In a way, it's the medieval equivalent of a shared aesthetic trend, like a certain kind of fashion photography that pops up in magazines across continents, each culture adapting it but keeping the same dreamy lighting and languid poses. Of course, ideals are double-edged. They can inspire, but they can also set impossible standards. You notice that the praise heaped on these figures is rarely about wit skill or courage. It's about the delicate curve of the neck, the softness of the gaze. You wonder how many real young men found themselves under pressure to fit that mold, just as modern actors or models find themselves typecast for a particular look. Beauty becomes a form of social currency, and like all currency, it can be spent too quickly or devalued over time. The musicians seem to understand this more than anyone. One evening, you sit in on a gathering where an oud player sings verses that at first seem like straightforward praise of a court favorite. But by the third stanza, you realize the song is about loss, how the gazelle has moved on, how the singer is left staring at an empty garden. The room grows quiet, the laughter fading, replaced by a kind of collective melancholy. It's a reminder that ideals are not just ornaments, they're also stories with beginnings and endings. You recall seeing similar patterns in other cultures' art, Renaissance painters obsessing over the same facial proportions, Japanese haiku, comparing lovers to cherry blossoms, modern filmmakers casting the same type in romantic leads. It's human to distill attraction into a set of symbols, and just as human to feel the bittersweet tug when those symbols shift or fade. The Abbasids are no exception. They've simply chosen the gazelle as their emblem, letting it run through their art, their music, and their whispered conversations in shaded colonnades. A scholar you meet one afternoon puts it more academically. The gazelle is a mirror, he says, reflecting what the admirer wishes to see. He adjusts his spectacles. Yes, even here, some scholars sport spectacles, and leans in as if sharing a secret. The real person is irrelevant. The image is the thing. It's a cool, almost cynical take, but you can't help thinking there's truth in it. Ideals, after all, tell us as much about the society that creates them as they do about the people who supposedly embody them. And so you walk away from the quarter that day with the image of a gazelle still flickering in your mind, not the animal itself, but the idea it carries. You've seen it painted on tile, woven into song, embroidered into the very language of poetry. It's a living thread in the Abbasid tapestry, one that will be picked up, reworked, and admired long after this particular court has vanished into the dust of history. You turn a corner in the palace complex, and suddenly the soundscape changes. Outside, the streets hum with bargaining and clatter. In here, voices are hushed, the air scented with sandalwood and something faintly floral. You've stepped into the part of the caliphal world where public performance gives way to private politics, the quarters of the inner court. Here, the favored companions of the ruler move like well-dressed shadows, their proximity to power measured not in official titles, but in the way a guard's eyes follow them, or in how a vizier shifts his seat to make space when they enter. It's in these spaces that relationships take on a political weight. A favored courtier can have the ear of the caliph during a game of chess, a stroll through the gardens, or while sipping sherbet under a silk canopy. One passing comment, half joke, half suggestion, might shape policy more than a week's worth of petitions from provincial governors. You can't help thinking of modern political advisors who aren't listed on any payroll, yet somehow appear in every candid photograph, always close enough to whisper. The Abbasid court had its own version, and the stakes were just as high. The favorites here are not just ornaments. Some are skilled poets or musicians whose art delights the caliph. Others are quick-witted conversationalists who can turn a tense discussion into laughter. A few have military experience, their charm matched by a capacity for strategy. The unspoken truth is that affection and influence intertwine. What begins as a personal bond can become a channel for political maneuvering. And because the court thrives on subtlety, these shifts happen quietly behind the lattice screens and painted doors, where the murmur of fountains drowns out more dangerous whispers. You notice how power expresses itself in the smallest details. A jeweled dagger gifted to a favorite signals more than generosity. It marks them as someone not to be trifled with. A new robe of imported brocade means more than a fashion update. It's a visible sign that the caliph's favor is intact. In a society where survival often depends on knowing which way the wind is blowing, these tokens are as significant as any decree. The merchants gossip about them the way modern journalists might parse the meaning of a president's dinner guest list. One evening, you happen to be in the audience for a private poetry recital. The caliph reclines on a low couch, favorites arranged nearby, like stars around a moon. A young man steps forward, his voice steady, his verses laced with playful double meanings. The caliph chuckles, glancing toward a particular courtier, whose smile deepens with each line. You realize this is more than entertainment. It's a public confirmation within this inner circle of a bond. everyone already suspects. The applause at the end is warm, but you can feel the ripple of calculation running through the room. Every laugh, every compliment, every shared glance is noted and remembered. The palace servants, of course, are the invisible audience to all of this. They carry letters, pour drinks, adjust cushions, and see everything. They're careful with their expressions, but you can imagine the quiet conversations that happen in the servants' quarters after hours. In a way, they're the ones who hold the truest version of court history, stripped of poetic flourish and official record. If you've ever known an office assistant who understands the company's real politics better than the CEO, you'll recognize the type. You also sense the fragility of these positions. A favorite's influence can vanish as quickly as it arrived. One wrong word, one ill-timed absence, or simply the caliph's shifting mood, and the silks and jewels are replaced by a quiet dismissal. Some manage to slip away with their wealth intact, retreating to estates on the Tigris. Others fade into obscurity, their names remembered only in the margins of scandalous poems. It's a reminder that in the Abbasid world, as in so many courts before and after proximity to power, is both intoxicating and perilous. Outside, the garden paths wind between marble fountains and date palms, their trunks wrapped in climbing jasmine. The same companions who laugh in the caliph's chambers stroll here at dusk playing chess on inlaid boards or reciting verses in low voices. The setting sun turns the palace walls gold, the air heavy with the scent of roses. For a moment, you can almost forget the political stakes and see it simply as a place of cultivated beauty. But even here, under the blush of evening light, you know that every gesture is part of a larger game, a game as old as empires played in silk instead of steel. By the time you wander into a Sufi lodge on the edge of the city, the noise of the markets has faded into a muffled hum like a distant tide. The walls are bare, but for calligraphy in looping, deliberate strokes, phrases about love, divine unity, and the heart's endless search for the beloved. At first glance, you might think the beloved here is purely spiritual, an abstract idea to be contemplated in candlelit silence. But as you settle among the circle of disciples, listening to the soft chant of poetry, you realize that the language blurs boundaries in ways that would make a theologian shift uneasily in his seat. The Sufis speak of yearning as if it is both a divine pull and a human ache. The verses slide easily between describing the beauty of God and the beauty of a human face. A master might compare the curve of a cheek to the crescent moon, or the scent of a beloved's hair to paradise gardens, and leave you to decide whether that beloved is mortal or eternal. It's a delicate ambiguity, a poetic tightrope where spiritual devotion and personal affection balance in the same line. And because the form is devotional, it moves through spaces that might otherwise have been closed to such open expressions of longing. You watch one disciple, eyes closed, rocking gently as the chanting deepens. His lips move in time with the words, a slight smile forming at a particular verse about the intoxication of love. You're reminded of how music can bypass the mind and go straight to the heart. How in any era, certain songs seem to speak both of romance and something bigger, something you can't quite name. In the Abbasid world, Sufi poetry often works the same way, creating an emotional space where desire and devotion are threads of the same fabric. Some of the great Sufi poets, like Al-Hallaj, were not afraid to push this fusion to dangerous extremes, speaking of union with God in ways that alarmed orthodox jurists. Others, like Rabia al-Adawiya, cloaked their words in the language of pure spiritual love, yet still painted it in colors borrowed from human passion. In gatherings like the one you're sitting in, these verses are shared without footnotes, without clarification. The ambiguity isn't a problem. It's the point. Each listener takes what they need from the words, whether that's a moment of piety or a memory of someone's eyes catching theirs across a courtyard. A Sufi master tells a story about a seeker who travels for years to find God, only to be told that the path begins with loving what is before you. How can you love the Creator? The master asks if you have not learned to love his creation. The room murmurs in agreement. It's the kind of statement that can sound innocuous until you realize how it could be used to defend feelings others might prefer to keep unspoken. In a culture where public morality and private inclination don't always align, such spiritual framing can offer shelter for otherwise risky sentiments. The setting itself feels like part of the teaching. The lodge is simple, its floor covered in woven mats, the air warm with the scent of burning oud. Light spills in through a single high window, painting the room in gold. You think about how in the bustling heart of the caliphate, these oases of quiet create a parallel world, one where the rules are more fluid, and where the language of love is wide enough to hold both heaven and earth. It's not so different from stepping into a modern concert or meditation retreat, where the outside world's definitions seem to blur and rearrange themselves at the door. As the evening deepens, the chanting turns to dance. The dervishes begin to move in slow measured circles, their robes fanning out like pale sails. The repetition is hypnotic, and you feel yourself pulled into the rhythm. Watching them, you sense that the boundary between the self and the other, between divine and human, has been deliberately softened. It's an openness that mirrors the very subject of the poetry, the belief that love in all its forms is a reflection of the divine. And perhaps that's the most subversive part, framing human affection as a step toward spiritual truth rather than a distraction from it. When the gathering ends, the disciples file out quietly, their faces lit with the calm of shared experience. You step into the night, the stars scattered above like tiny lamps, the air cool against your skin. The verses you've heard stay with you, not because they resolved anything, but because they refuse to draw hard lines where the heart prefers curves. You cross the sea in your mind before you've even realized you've boarded the ship westward to the far edge of the caliphate, where the Mediterranean's salt air seeps into everything. Al-Andalus greets you not with Baghdad's dust, but with the mingled scent of orange blossoms and ocean breeze. Here in Muslim Spain, the same threads of poetry and art you've seen in the East have been woven into something both familiar and entirely new. The palaces of Cordoba and Granada seem designed for lingering arches, like ripples of frozen water courtyards, where fountains catch the sunlight and scatter it in silver shards. In these gardens, the nights are long and perfumed, and the gatherings tilt toward the luxurious. Court poets in Al-Andalus, many of them influenced by both Arabic and local Iberian traditions, do not shy away from the same homoerotic themes you heard in Baghdad. Yet here, the imagery often carries the tang of the sea or the sweetness of ripe fruit. You listen to a recitation under a crescent moon, where a beloved is compared to the blush of pomegranate skin or the glint of fish scales in shallow water. It's the same art of suggestion wrapped in a different geography. A local singer strums a lute-like instrument called the ud's voice, drawing out the syllables as if to savor them. The song slides between longing and playfulness, the audience laughing softly at a clever rhyme, then falling silent at a tender image. You notice how the rhythm of the language mirrors the rhythm of the place slower than Baghdad, but no less charged. The Al-Andalus courts are skilled at turning evenings into worlds of their own, where politics and poetry mingle under the same lantern light. You meet a scholar who insists that the mingling of cultures here, Arab, Berber, Visigothic, and Jewish, has made the poetic language richer. It's like a stew. He says many flavors, each making the other stronger. You think of how cross-cultural influence often sparks new artistic forms, much like jazz in the modern era, where different traditions collide and produce something unexpected. In Al-Andalus, the fusion doesn't dilute the passion in the poetry. It refines it, adding new metaphors, new layers of meaning. Wandering through a palace courtyard, you pause by a wall where tiles form intricate geometric patterns in blue and white. The symmetry is perfect, but your eye catches on a small, deliberate flaw, a motif slightly misaligned. A court artisan explains half-joking that perfection belongs only to God. Yet the tiny imperfection somehow makes the whole wall more human, more alive. You realize that this principle applies to the court culture here too. For all its refinement, it is the unguarded moment, the quick glance, the unscripted verse that gives the night its pulse. One evening in Seville, you attend a literary salon hosted by a wealthy patron whose estate overlooks the river. Guests recline on cushions, sipping drinks sweetened with honey and scented with cinnamon. A young poet recites a verse comparing his beloved to a falcon, proud, elusive, capable of piercing the heart with a single look. The room reacts with a low murmur of approval, some smiling in recognition of the coded language others caught in their own reveries. It's not just about the beloved, it's about the shared understanding that desire, in all its shades, is part of the human story. In the markets, the next day, you catch fragments of last night's verses repeated by street performers, stripped of their ornament but keeping their core. The poetry has escaped the palace, moving through the city like perfume on the wind. It's a reminder that art here isn't just for the elite. It seeps into the fabric of daily life. Much like a catchy tune today might leave the concert hall and become a street musician staple, these verses cross boundaries with ease. And yet beneath the laughter and music, you sense the same undercurrent that ran through Baghdad, the awareness that openness has limits, and that limits can shift. In Al-Andalus, political tides change as quickly as the moon's pull on the tide. For now, though, the gardens are open, the lamps are lit, and the verses flow without fear. You step back into the night air, the sound of a distant lute following you, and the scent of orange blossoms lingering like a promise you know can't last forever. You drift east again, following the trade routes that carry silk spices and ideas back toward the Persian heartlands. Here the air is drier, the mountains rise sharper, and the cultural landscape shifts. Persian court traditions older than Islam itself fold seamlessly into the Abbasid and later Caliphal courts, bringing with them a particular polish in manners poetry and the art of pleasure. If Baghdad's court feels like a bustling theater and Al-Andalus like a moonlit garden party, the Persian-influenced courts are more like a jeweler's workshop, precise, deliberate, and utterly attentive to detail. The architecture mirrors this refinement. In Isfahan or Nishapur, you walk into halls where carpets unfurl like rivers of color, each thread dyed with impossible patience. The walls are painted with scenes of banquets hunts and quiet interludes, where a favored companion sits beside a ruler, pouring wine or exchanging a smile. The gestures are small, but telling a hand on a shoulder the lean of two heads close together over a chessboard. These scenes are not drawn in a rush. They are deliberate records of the court's ideals, and affection, whether platonic or more, is part of the picture. Persian poetry, too, brings its own tone to the conversation. The metaphors grow denser, the imagery lush with gardens, nightingales, and wine cups that brim over. A beloved might be compared to a cypress tree for their tall grace, or to the first rose of spring for their beauty and fragility. These are not casual compliments. They are part of a sophisticated symbolic system that carries layers of meaning for those who know how to read them. And in Persian tradition, those symbols are often infused with the bittersweet knowledge that beauty fades and joy slips away, making the moment all the more precious. You hear a performance in a candlelit chamber, the poet's voice deep and deliberate, the words spilling like pomegranate seeds onto the carpet. The verses praise a companion, whose loyalty is matched only by their elegance, and the ruler listening smiles, lifting a cup in silent acknowledgement. It's clear, this is not just entertainment, it's part of a ritual of courtly life, a way of reaffirming bonds, without needing a contract or a decree. You think of how, in modern diplomacy, a toast or a compliment in the right language can cement an alliance more effectively than a signed treaty. Persian refinements also influence dress and behavior. Court favorites wear robes of silk embroidered with silver thread, their hair perfumed with rose oil, their hands adorned with rings that catch the candlelight. They move with the measured grace of people who know they are being watched and who understand that in this world, beauty and comportment are tools of influence. The way they serve wine, the way they pause before speaking each gesture, is a kind of performance one that the audience, whether ruler or courtier, reads with practiced eyes. You meet an elderly calligrapher who insists that Persian culture brought not just elegance, but a sense of continuity to the caliphal courts. We have always known, he says, that beauty is a form of power. He dips his brush into ink the color of midnight, drawing letters that curve like vines. And power is not always in the sword, it is in the gaze, the word, the gift. You realize that in this world, the arts are not an escape from politics, but one of its most subtle weapons. Even the gardens here are different. Walled and symmetrical, they are laid out in geometric patterns that mirror the order of the universe as imagined by Persian thinkers. Water channels divide the space into perfect quadrants, each planted with flowers in deliberate color schemes. You walk along a shaded path and see a ruler seated beneath a cypress, listening to a lute player whose song drifts upward into the warm night. It's easy to forget in such surroundings that beyond these walls, the world is less forgiving. But perhaps that is the point, to create a space where beauty and refinement can momentarily eclipse the harsher edges of reality. The Persian influence doesn't erase the openness you saw in Baghdad or the sensuality of Al-Andalus. It distills them, dresses them in finer cloth, and teaches them how to move with quiet precision. Here, affection is not flaunted with bold jokes or moonlit banter. It is woven into the fabric of courtly life, visible only to those who know where to look. And in that subtlety, it becomes something just as enduring as the poetry that celebrates it. The further you wander into the corridors of scholarly debate, the less the air smells of roses and sandalwood, and the more it smells of ink leather, and the faint tang of heated argument. You've reached the domain of the jurists, The men who pore over Quranic verses, hadith collections, and legal precedents, determined to clarify where affection, desire, and propriety ought to stand. They sit cross-legged in study circles, voices rising and falling like the tide, each quotation from Scripture punctuated by a careful pause. Here, the question of same-gender affection isn't just whispered about in poetry or played out in the palace. It's dissected like a fine problem in mathematics. Some scholars focus on the letter of the law, emphasizing prohibitions with stern clarity. Others, perhaps more attuned to the realities of court life, try to navigate the space between what is ideal and what is practiced. You listen to one jurist argue that admiration for beauty is permissible as long as it remains chaste, while his counterpart insists that even the gaze is a slippery slope. You can almost hear the centuries-old sigh in that statement. It's the same weary caution parents everywhere have voiced about not leading anyone on. What makes this all the more intriguing is that many jurists are fully aware of what goes on in the upper echelons of power. They hear the same verses, see the same favored companions, and sometimes even serve as advisors to the very rulers whose tastes they are now attempting to regulate. One scholar with a beard white as linen remarks dryly, "The caliph's court is not a madrasa earning a few chuckles from his colleagues. There's a sense here of a long, unending tug of war between the ideals of the law and the realities of human behavior." The written fatwas from this era reveal the complexity of their task. Some read like stern reprimands, warning of divine punishment. Others take on a more nuanced tone, acknowledging the admiration of beauty as part of human nature, but urging self-control. A few even slip into the language of metaphor themselves, as if unable to resist the pull of the very literary traditions they're meant to caution against. It's a reminder that even in debates framed as purely legal, the cultural currents of the time are impossible to ignore. You notice, too, the practical politics underneath. Rulers sometimes encourage a stricter line from jurists when they need to project moral authority, say after a scandal or during a time of unrest. At other times, they quietly prefer a more relaxed interpretation, allowing the pleasures of the court to proceed without too much public fuss. The law, in these moments, becomes a tool to be tightened or loosened as the situation demands. If you've ever seen a modern leader shift from strict policy enforcement to turning a blind eye when it suits them, you'll recognize the pattern instantly. There's a particular tension when the scholar's rulings run headlong into celebrated art. Imagine a jurist delivering a sermon on modesty the same week that a popular poet's verses about a handsome court page are being recited from Damascus to Basra. The public can hold both ideas in their heads at once, admiring the piety of the sermon and memorizing the poem for later retelling. This duality frustrates some jurists, but others accept it as inevitable, even wryly, quoting the poets themselves during lessons to make a point. One afternoon, you sit in on a debate where the focus is not condemnation, but prevention. The scholars discuss ways to keep temptation at bay, separating sleeping quarters for students, discouraging excessive ornamentation, and dress-limiting private conversations between young men in certain contexts. It all sounds very thorough until you remember the palace gardens, the salons, the music-filled courtyards, and you wonder if these measures were ever more than a polite fiction. Yet for all their attempts to draw bright lines, the jurists' very engagement with the subject shows how deeply embedded it is in the culture they serve. If it were marginal, it wouldn't need so many rulings, counter-rulings, and fine distinctions. And that may be the most telling point of all the conversation between affection and law in the Islamic Caliphates was never silent. It was a running dialogue conducted in libraries and lecture halls, echoing in the same cities where verses of longing floated on the night air. The mood shifts as you move through the streets in a later century of the Caliphates. The markets are still loud. The bread still smells warm from the ovens, but there's a faint tension in the air, as if a cloud has passed over the sun. You hear it in the tone of public sermons, sharper now, more insistent on rules and boundaries. Where once poets and musicians could slip double meanings into their verses with little fear, the tolerance for such playfulness has begun to shrink. Orthodoxy, like a tightening belt, is cinching in the space that once allowed for a certain openness. You remember the laughing salons of early Abbasid Baghdad and the moonlit gardens of Al-Andalus, and the contrast is stark. In some places, public recitation of suggestive poetry is discouraged or outright banned. Poets still write it, of course they always will, but more of it is shared in private among trusted friends. The social dance you once saw, played openly in courtyards, now retreats behind closed doors, its steps still familiar, but hidden from the street. It's a reminder that culture isn't static. It bends to the political and religious winds of the time, sometimes sharply. Part of this change comes from political necessity. Rulers facing external threats or internal unrest often turn to religious authority to shore up legitimacy. A stricter moral code becomes a kind of public armor, a way of signaling strength, unity, and divine favor. The result is a tightening of control over art, literature, and behavior. You can see parallels in other societies, how during times of war or crisis, governments clamp down on what can be said, sung, or performed, trading the easy charm of openness for the rigid clarity of rules. And yet, even as the public face of the caliphates grows more serious, private spaces still hum with a quieter continuity. In the homes of certain patrons, poetry readings continue, though the metaphors may be layered more thickly to avoid trouble. The imagery of the gazelle, the moon, the nightingale doesn't vanish, it simply becomes more coded like a language spoken behind a hand. This adaptation is its own kind of resilience proof that a tradition can survive even in a colder climate if it's willing to wear a thicker coat. You notice that the shift isn't uniform. In some regions, particularly on the fringes of the caliphates, older customs linger longer. A court in one province might still host musical evenings, while in another, the same gathering could draw disapproval or even punishment. This unevenness creates a patchwork of experiences, moments of openness, scattered like pockets of warm air in an otherwise cooling season. For travelers moving between cities, the difference could be startling, a warm welcome in one place, a cautious silence in the next. Artists adjust, as they always do. Some turn to safer subjects focusing on landscapes, moral tales, or religious themes. Others become masters of subtlety, crafting verses that can be read as spiritual devotion by one audience and romantic longing by another. It's a game of interpretation, one that relies on the shared cultural memory of more open times. If you've ever seen a filmmaker slip a daring message past the censors by dressing it in allegory, you understand the skill involved. For ordinary people, these changes alter the texture of daily life. In earlier centuries, a passerby might hear a street musician playing a familiar love song without raising eyebrows. Now those same notes might be met with frowns or quiet warnings. Public spaces feel more supervised, more attuned to potential transgression. The open laughter of a court poet teasing a favored companion is replaced by careful glances to see who might be listening. Still, as you walk through a narrow alley at dusk, you catch a fragment of song from behind a shuttered window. The voice is low, the words almost swallowed by the hum of the city, but the melody is unmistakable. It's one you heard in a palace garden long ago, when the night was young and the rules were looser. That faint echo reminds you that culture once rooted doesn't vanish overnight. It adapts, waits, and sometimes reemerges when the wind changes again. The centuries turn dynasties rise and fall, and yet you notice something uncanny threads from those early vivid centuries keep surfacing in unexpected places. You might be standing in a 21st century cafe in Istanbul, a book of classical Arabic poetry open on the table, and realize that the lines you're reading lines written under Abbasid patronage or in an Andalusian courtyard still carry the same playful double meanings. The language has aged, the world has changed, but the way desire, admiration, and coded affection are woven into verse has survived like an underground stream. In some modern cities across the Muslim world, you see the old patterns replayed in subtler form. Public norms may emphasize modesty, but private gatherings, dinner parties, literary salons, musical nights often echo the intimacy of those historical courts. A well-placed compliment, an artful joke, or a song performed just for one listener carries the same charge it did 1,000 years ago. The audience may not be wearing silk robes or reclining on cushions under carved cedar ceilings, but the dynamic, the mixture of wit beauty and a touch of risk is familiar. And in art, the echoes are even clearer. Contemporary calligraphers sometimes hide a beloved's name in the flowing script of a larger religious text, a wink to those who know where to look. Photographers stage portraits in gardens designed to resemble the symmetrical courtyards of Persian palaces. Musicians adapt old lyrics into new melodies, the original metaphors intact, leaving it to the listener to decide whether the gazelle in the song is divine or human. It's a continuation of the ambiguity that once let Sufi mystics and court poets share the same vocabulary. You also hear the debates still rumbling in religious and academic circles. Jurists and scholars revisit the same questions that were argued in candlelit study halls centuries ago. Where does admiration end and transgression begin? How should art handle subjects that sit at the edge of propriety? The answers vary as widely now as they did then, shaped by local culture, political climate, and personal interpretation. In some places, the old poetry is celebrated openly as part of the heritage. In others, it is quietly shelved, too risky to quote without context. In the digital age, the conversation moves faster, but keeps the same layered quality. Online forums discuss historical figures like Abu Nuwas with a mix of admiration and caution. Young poets post verses on social media that borrow the imagery of moonlight roses and nightingales, tagging them as classical style while letting their followers draw their own conclusions. The internet becomes a new kind of courtyard where coded language can spread in seconds instead of years. You think about how traditions survive not always in straight lines, but in loops and spirals. What began in the intimacy of a palace garden can find its way into a wedding song in Morocco, a novel in Cairo, or a quiet conversation over tea in Jakarta. The medium changes, the setting changes, but the essence, the human impulse to blend beauty, wit, and affection remains stubbornly alive. It's like the fragrance of jasmine, faint in the heat of day, stronger at night, and capable of traveling far from the garden where it first bloomed. On a warm evening in a modern city, you hear music drifting from an open window. The words are old, The arrangement new, but the effect is the same as it was in the Abbasid court. Someone stops in the street, listening. You can almost see the line stretching back through time, through the gazelle-eyed pages, the moonlit Andalusian gardens, the candle-lit Persian halls, and the Sufi lodges where longing blurred with devotion. And you realize that the untold history isn't just in the past, it's also in the present, still unfolding in small, quiet moments, carried by anyone who knows how to read between the lines. You tramp along the uneven planks of the pier boot's creaking air, salted with that sharp tang that prickles your nose. The shoreline isn't glamorous, and whoever told you pirates spent all day chasing treasure clearly skipped over the part where you dig through fishy baskets and haggle over barrels of beans. Still, this is the moment you prepare for weeks, maybe months, at sea. The markets of a port town are your battlefield today, and your enemies are mold hunger and merchants who know exactly how desperate a crew can get before setting sail. You've got a pouch of coins and a mental list, but half of it depends on whatever the tide has delivered in the past week. Sometimes the most valuable thing isn't gold. It's a sack of onions that won't turn to mush before you're halfway to the next port. A stall to your left catches your attention, not for its charm, but for the pile of dried wrinkled peas staring up at you like green marbles. Not the sort of thing you'd serve at a royal banquet, but you know from experience they'll last longer than half the men on your crew. The seller, a weathered woman with a kerchief knotted tight under her chin, doesn't waste time with pleasantries. She knows you'll pay, and you know she's right. You trade a few coins and sling the sack over your shoulder. The weight is comforting, like carrying a piece of certainty into a very uncertain future. Around the corner, there's a cluster of fishermen gutting their morning catch. The smell, well, it's either invigorating or revolting, depending on how many days you've gone without fresh air below deck. You've learned to look for fish, with eyes still bright skin, firm to the touch. Not because you plan to eat them tonight, but because if you pack them right with layers of coarse salt that could scratch paint off a hull, they'll survive the coming weeks without turning into an onboard crime scene. One fisherman holds up a long silver barracuda, its scales catching the sun like armor. You nod the universal sign of wrap it up before someone else grabs it. Further along, you duck into a shaded alley where the more discreet transactions happen. Here, you can get goods that aren't technically illegal, but are certainly unofficial. A burlap sack of rice that's avoided royal tax collectors somehow finds its way into your stores. A wheel of cheese, its rind hard enough to withstand a storm, gets rolled down to the dock by two boys who could barely lift it. You slip them each a copper for their trouble, not generosity exactly, but an investment in the hope they'll remember you when you come back. The air shifts as you near the spice merchant. You can smell the cinnamon and pepper before you see them, the scents drifting over like invisible threads. These are less about preservation and more about morale. Food on a ship can be bland, monotonous. Even a pinch of pepper can transform boiled something into boiled something with personality. The merchant stall is a riot of colors. Saffron in delicate cloth packets, nutmeg rolling in little baskets, black pepper piled high. You can almost hear your ship's cook sigh in relief when you hand over a few precious coins for enough spice to keep the crew from complaining at least about the taste. Down at the end of the dock, the real bulk buying begins. Barrels big, stubborn things that take two men to roll are stacked like fortifications. Flour for hardtack more salt for the fish, dried beans, and the occasional cask of dried fruit if you're feeling generous or optimistic. You eye the raisins. They'll keep for months, and on a bad day, they might even pass for dessert. The cooper thumps the side of each barrel before you pay listening for the right hollow ring that says the wood is sound. A leaky barrel is a waste of money and an open invitation to rot. Every purchase has its ritual. You lift sniff taste when you can. You haggle, but never so hard that a merchant decides to save their best goods for someone else. Ports remember pirates sometimes too well, and a reputation as a fair enough buyer can mean the difference between salted cod and something vaguely resembling it. You've even learned to nod at the dockside cats, those sleek little enforcers who keep rats from chewing through your stores before you even set sail. A sudden shout from further down the pier pulls your attention. A young sailor from another crew is trying unsuccessfully to convince a baker to part with his last crate of ship's biscuit. You watch as the baker folds his arms unmoved. Ship's biscuit isn't exactly a treat. It's more like a survival challenge you chew. But when you're weeks into a voyage, it's the difference between hungry and thinking about mutiny. The sailor walks away empty-handed, and you make a mental note to stop by that bakery before you leave. Not because you need it immediately, but because in this game, you stock what you can when you can. By the time the sun tilts toward the horizon, your crew has staggered back to the ship with baskets, barrels, and sacks. The deck smells like a strange blend of the day's purchases. Sharp vinegar from pickled vegetables, briny fish, earthy grains. It's a promise of survival, if not exactly comfort. You know from experience that once the anchor lifts, the shore's abundance turns into the sea's strict rationing. Every bite will be measured against the days left before landfall. And as you glance at the leaning pile of barrels, you know the next step isn't about finding food. It's about making sure it lasts. You plant your hands on the rim of a barrel, the wood cool and damp from the morning air, and give it a testing shove. It groans across the deck, the iron hoops clinking faintly. This is where the real work begins, preserving what you just spent all day collecting, so it doesn't turn into a science experiment before you've even cleared the harbor. You've learned the hard way that food on a pirate ship lives or dies by the barrel, and the only thing standing between a haul of fresh meat and a festering disaster is brine salt and the stubborn will to keep the crew fed. The first cask you crack open holds coarse sea salt crystals the size of pebbles, sharp enough to scrape your knuckles if you plunge your hand in too fast. Salt is worth its weight in gold out here, not for flavor, but for its ability to pull the life out of anything trying to grow on your dinner. You watch as a crewman layers fish into another barrel. Fish salt, each slab pressed down firmly. It's not elegant. There's no artistry here, but if done right, those fish will taste almost the same in a month as they do now. Almost. Next to him, the cook is tackling a joint of beef, something you won't see often this far from port. It's been trimmed and cut into manageable pieces, each one rubbed with salt until the surface looks like frost on a winter morning. You know some captains swear by a quick dunk in brine, first a salty bath that seeps into every fiber before packing the meat away. The smell is strong, not unpleasant yet, but it clings to your clothes like an overfamiliar friend. Not everything goes straight into salt. Some barrels are for pickling a trick pirates borrowed from traders who needed to keep vegetables alive on long voyages. You lean over one as vinegar fumes rise to meet you sharp enough to make your eyes water. Into it, Go onions, cucumbers, and a handful of carrots, anything that won't collapse under the acid's bite. It's a brutal process for the vegetables, but in return, they'll stay crisp long after the fresh produce is gone. Pickled cabbage is a particular prize. It's cheap, it keeps well, and it's good for morale when the rest of the meal is brown and beige. The cooper, the barrel maker, stands by with mallet and chisel, checking each container for leaks before sealing it up. He's as important as the quartermaster when it comes to survival, though less likely to be celebrated in pirate songs. A single loose stave can undo hours of work, letting brine leak out and spoil the contents. You hear the hollow tap of his mallet, the approving grunt when the wood rings true. It's a small comfort knowing the walls that guard your food are solid. You can't help but think about how this system barrels and brine has kept sailors alive for centuries. Long before pirates prowled these waters, the same methods carried merchant fleets and navies across oceans. Even the mighty Spanish galleons relied on salted meat to feed their crews as they sailed back with silver from the New World. In a way, these barrels are more valuable than the loot in your hold. Without them, you wouldn't make it to the next raid. As the sun dips lower, shadows stretch across the deck, and the brining operation becomes a slow, deliberate rhythm. You hear the scrape of salt against wood, the slosh of vinegar, the thud of lids being hammered into place. It's almost hypnotic, and you realize that for all the chaos, pirates are known for this part of the job demands order. A misplaced handful of salt, a poorly sealed lid, those are the mistakes that creep up weeks later when the middle of the ocean offers no second chances. You think of modern times, how easy it is now to open a fridge and trust what's inside. No one today has to decide between eating something slightly questionable or going hungry for days. Out here, though, the line between edible and regrettable is thin, and you guard it with every scoop of salt and every turn of the mallet. Maybe that's why you take such care now, even if the younger crew think you're just being fussy. A gust of wind carries the smell of the day's work out over the water. It's a mix of ocean meat vinegar and wood, a scent that to you means security. It's not romantic, not the stuff of adventure ballads, but it's what keeps a pirate ship moving when the horizon is nothing but blue in every direction. You've packed the fish, the meat, the vegetables. The barrels are stacked in the cool, shadowed belly of the ship, each one labeled in chalk. Up on deck, you wipe your hands on your trousers, leaving streaks of white salt dust. You glance at the line of barrels one last time, knowing they'll be your silent companions for weeks. But there's still the matter of the ship's biscuit, those infamously hard rations that can outlast almost anything except maybe your teeth. You squat beside the crate, prying up the lid with the tip of your knife, and there it is, the legendary ship's biscuit, stacked in uneven piles like pale paving stones. At first glance, it doesn't look threatening, just flat round slabs of baked dough. But the moment you pick one up, you remember why sailors call it hardtack. It's not bread in the sense you know it. It's more like a weapon disguised as food. You rap it against the deck out of habit, and it makes a sound dangerously close to a knock on oak. Hardtack is a cruel little miracle. Just flour water and a dash of salt if the cook was feeling generous. No yeast, no softness. Nothing that invites mold to set up camp. Baked until it's dry all the way through, it's practically immortal if you keep it away from damp. There's a good chance the biscuits in front of you were made months ago in some shore bakery, stacked in sacks, and then forgotten in a warehouse until a ship like yours came calling. And still, they'll last the length of a voyage and beyond. In fact, you've heard of biscuits found in storage decades later that were technically edible. Not pleasant, but edible. You slide one into your coat pocket and bite down experimentally. The thing doesn't so much break as it challenges your jaw to a duel. You've learned to soak it in something water broth, even ale, until it softens enough to chew, without risking a dentist's fortune. Though dentists aren't exactly thick on the ground out here, soaking also helps flush out any unwanted residents. Weevil's tiny stowaways with a taste for flour have been the ship's biscuits' worst-kept secret for as long as anyone can remember. You've heard the cook joke that a few weevils add protein, but you're not buying it. The quartermaster passes by and sees you turning the biscuit over in your hand like it's an archaeological find. He chuckles, telling you about one captain who swore he could tell the age of a hardtack just by the color of its surface. Darker meant older, though in truth, it mostly meant someone forgot it in the oven. Another crew swore by smashing biscuits with the butt of a pistol before eating, claiming it made them taste better. You're pretty sure that's just an excuse to use a pistol indoors. You can't help but think about how this plain, unyielding ration is one of the reasons your ship can wander so far from home. It's cheap to make easy to store and won't betray you halfway through a voyage. The British Royal Navy built entire campaigns on the back of hardtack, and pirates practical as ever borrowed the idea without asking permission. You've even heard that during sieges on land, armies would adopt the same stuff, though without the gentle rocking of a ship to accompany it. Every now and then, you'll hear a new recruit groan about the biscuits wishing for soft bread. That's when you remember your first weeks at sea, how you too pined for something fresh, something with life in it. But after a few storms and a long stretch of blue horizon with no land in sight, you learn to appreciate the hardtack's stubborn loyalty. It doesn't spoil. It doesn't crumble. It doesn't demand much, just that you respect its limits and don't bite into it without a plan. You stack a few biscuits into a small cloth bag and sling it over your shoulder, knowing the cook will ration them out with a miser's care. There'll be breakfast some days, filler for stews on others, and occasionally a reluctant dessert if you're down to the last supplies. Sometimes when the night is calm and the stars stretch across the sky like spilled sugar, you'll nibble on one while leaning against the rail, letting its blandness be a reminder that survival isn't always glamorous. From the corner of your eye, you notice the sun flashing on the taut lines above, where strips of fish are hanging to dry. Salt works wonders, but out here, there's another preservation trick that doesn't require a single barrel. You tilt your head back and squint up into the rigging, where strips of fish sway gently in the breeze, like odd maritime bunting. The sun catches on their surfaces, turning the flesh translucent in places, and you can almost hear the slow whisper of moisture leaving them. Drying in the open air is one of those ancient preservation tricks that doesn't care whether you're a fisherman, a trader, or a pirate. It just works, provided you can keep the gulls from helping themselves. Up close, the setup is deceptively simple. Thin cuts of meat or fish strung up on clean lines, spread far enough apart so air can circulate on all sides. The sun does most of the work, but the wind is the quiet partner in this arrangement, pulling the damp out little by little until what's left is tough light and safe from rot. You've seen it done in a dozen ports: mackerel in the Caribbean beef strips in West Africa, Even squid hung like laundry in the Mediterranean, and every culture swears by its own twist on the method. On deck, a couple of crewmen are tending the hanging catch like it's a prize crop. One brushes away a persistent fly, while the other checks the knots. A snapped line means one lost meal, and nobody's in the mood for that. The smell is sharp, but clean, far from the rank odor of fish gone wrong. You know from experience that when the drying's done, the fish will keep for weeks, especially if you wrap it in cloth and store it somewhere dry. The taste will be concentrated salty and a bit leathery, but when you're 3 weeks out to sea, it's a welcome chew. It's not just fish that gets this treatment. Strips of beef, goat, or pork can be sun-dried too often after a quick rub of salt or spice to keep the surface safe from anything curious. In some ports, you've even picked up dried fruit mangoes, figs, or apples sliced thin and left to wither in the heat until they become sweet, chewy coins of concentrated flavor. They're rare finds for a pirate, but worth their weight when the rest of the meal is heavy and briny. There's something almost peaceful about watching the food dry in the rigging. The ship rolls gently, the lines sway, and the strips turn slightly in the wind, making sure every side gets its share of sun. You can imagine the same scene hundreds of years earlier. A Viking longship with cod hanging over the deck, a Chinese treasure junk with racks of duck drying in the open air. The method hasn't changed because it doesn't need to. Of course, nothing on a pirate ship is ever left entirely alone. A cheeky young deckhand wanders over and pretends to inspect one of the drying fish with his teeth. He earns a sharp word from the cook, who's quick to remind everyone that these strips are survival rations, not snacks for when you're bored. You can't help but grin. It's a familiar dance. Everyone knows how precious dried meat and fish become once the fresh stores are gone. You think about how this technique, so humble and low-tech, still thrives today. In corner shops, packets of beef jerky and dried squid hang just like they did here. Only now, they're wrapped in plastic with bright labels. Some people buy them for road trips, others for hiking, but it's the same principle: light, long-lasting, and packed with enough flavor to distract you from the fact that it's been preserved for weeks, maybe months. By late afternoon, the strips have taken on a firmer texture. They're not ready yet rushing. This process is a fast track to mold. But the progress is clear. The cook decides they'll stay up overnight, guarded from any nighttime rain by a loose canvas cover. It's a delicate balance: too much moisture left inside, and they'll rot. Too much sun too fast, and they turn brittle and tasteless. The sea breeze is your ally here, carrying away just enough damp to make them safe without stealing their character. As you turn away, your eyes fall on a nearby barrel with its lid propped open. Inside, a glint of vinegar and the faint smell of cloves hint at another preservation trick, waiting to be uncovered, one that can make vegetables last nearly as long as dried fish. You lean over the open barrel, and the vinegar fumes rise like a sharp greeting. It's the sort of smell that can snap you out of a daydream and make you blink twice. Floating inside are onions, their skins translucent from weeks of soaking, and cucumbers that have traded their crisp green for a muted, briny hue. This is the world of pickling, a method that pirates didn't invent, but happily adopted from anyone who had a good idea and didn't guard it closely enough. The beauty of vinegar is that it doesn't care about the heat, the humidity, or the days without fresh supplies. It's a hostile environment for anything that might spoil your food, and it treats vegetables with an odd kind of discipline. They come out tasting nothing, like they went in sharper, saltier, sometimes tinged with whatever spices you've tossed into the mix. The cook on your ship likes to add cloves and peppercorns, a habit picked up in a port where such spices were as common as rope. On good days, there might be bay leaves or mustard seeds drifting in the brine like tiny treasures. You fish out a slice of pickled carrot and bite down. There's the crunch, the sour bite, and just enough sweetness to take the edge off. After weeks of salted fish and hardtack, this sharpness feels like a reminder that your taste buds are still alive. The crew knows it too. When the pickle barrel is cracked open, there's always a quiet ripple of interest, and suddenly, men who claim to hate vegetables are lining up with their bowls. Pickling isn't just about variety, it's about strategy. Fresh vegetables are rare on a long voyage, and the risk of scurvy lurks in the background like an uninvited guest. Citrus gets most of the glory in that fight, but pickled cabbage, onions, and peppers carry their own small arsenal of vitamins. You've heard stories of ships avoiding the worst simply because they had enough sauerkraut in their stores, a lesson the great naval powers eventually took to heart. Pirates less concerned with official records and more with survival learned it by experience. In the dim light of the hold barrels of pickles, sit stacked next to salted meat and dried fish, the three pillars of shipboard preservation. You notice how the vinegar's tang cuts through the heavier smells, lending the air a cleaner edge. It's almost comforting, like the smell of a well-used kitchen back on shore, if that kitchen happened to roll side to side and occasionally take on water. Once in a market in Jamaica, you saw a vendor selling pickled mango slices in bright glass jars. They glowed golden in the sunlight, the fruit suspended like amber. You didn't have the coin for such luxuries then, but the image stuck with you. On a pirate ship, such a jar would be passed around, with the reverence usually reserved for a chest of gold. Even a small piece would be savored slowly, a bite of sweetness, against the backdrop of brine and salt. Pickling has a kind of poetry to it, though no one says so out loud. It's the act of capturing a moment, the freshness of a cucumber, the snap of a carrot, and holding it safe against the march of time and tide. Out here, where the days blur together and the horizon shifts but never vanishes, that feels like a small kind of magic. The cook sets the lid back on the barrel. With a firm push, the wooden hoop squeaking against the rim. The smell lingers, but the work moves on. Nearby, a smaller cask sits in the shade, marked with a crude carving of a lemon. You know what's inside isn't for flavor alone, but for something far more vital, a weapon in the quiet, invisible war every sailor fights. You lift the lid on the small cask, and the scent of citrus rolls out bright clean and almost startling after days of brine and vinegar. Inside, lemons and limes float in a light syrup of their own juice, some halved, some whole, their skins dimpled but still shining. They don't look like much. But you know, these are as valuable as any gold coin in the captain's chest. These are your defense against scurvy, the quiet thief that can gut a crew long before a cannonball ever does. You've heard the stories. Of course, sailors on long voyages losing their strength, gums swelling until teeth loosened, old wounds reopening without warning. It sounded like superstition the first time you heard it. How could a lack of fruit do so much damage? But you've seen it once, and once is enough. That was on a ship that sailed from Africa to the Caribbean without a single lemon in the hold. By the time they made landfall, half the crew could barely stand, and two never walked again. The cure is almost insultingly simple citrus. Lemons, limes, even oranges if you can get them. Pirates aren't in the business of following Navy regulations, but this is one rule they'll keep without question. When you can, you buy them fresh at port. When you can't, you preserve them, packed in brine and syrup, or even sliced and dried to be rehydrated later. Whatever it takes to keep that sharp, sour bite in reach. You roll a lime between your palms, feeling the oil release under the skin. It's strange to think that something so small can keep a crew alive. In the Royal Navy, they started issuing daily rations of lime juice in the late 18th century, earning their sailors the nickname limeys. Pirates never had nicknames like that, stick probably because they were too busy coming up with ones for themselves. But the habit of guarding citrus was just as strong. On your ship, the cook squeezes a wedge into the water ration now, and then especially when the casks start tasting a little too much, like their wooden walls. It's a small burst of brightness in a day's drinking, and it carries with it the unspoken knowledge that you're dodging a slow, miserable fate. Sometimes on calmer days, slices end up in a pot of fish stew, giving it a tang that wakes everyone up around the mess table. There's also a quiet kind of barter value in these fruits. In a lean port, a single lemon can be traded for fresh bread or a pouch of tobacco. You've even seen a captain give a lime as a gift to a rival, a rare peace offering at sea, where grudges usually run deeper than the water under your keel. The message was clear. We may fight tomorrow, but today, I'd rather you stay alive. The cask is small, deliberately so. Citrus doesn't last forever, even preserved, and letting it sit too long is a waste no one can afford. Better to keep the supply lean and steady, replacing it at each port. You make a mental note to ask the quartermaster how many are left, though you suspect he guards that number like a state secret. From above, you hear a splash and a burst of laughter, a couple of deckhands rinsing out an empty water cask. It reminds you of another trick the crew swears by, one that has nothing to do with fruit and everything to do with keeping that water drinkable just a little longer. You follow the sound of the laughter to the main deck, where a crewman is pouring a splash of rum into a freshly rinsed water cask. He swirls it around like he's mixing paint, the scent rising into the air with a warm, sweet burn. It's not just an indulgence, though. No pirate worth his salt would complain about an excuse to drink. It's a preservation trick as old as the sea lanes. Rum kills off the things in the water that you can't see, but will certainly feel if you drink them. Fresh water at sea is a fragile thing. The moment it's drawn from a well or stream and sealed in a barrel, the clock starts ticking. Stale flavors creep in within days, and worse, tiny organisms invisible but determined can turn it foul before you're halfway to your next port. A bad cask is a mutiny waiting to happen. That's why pirates never keen on sickness or dissent learn to spike their water with something that would keep it from turning into a swamp in a barrel. Rum is the obvious choice. In the Caribbean, especially, it's as common as rope distilled from the molasses left over from sugar production. It's strong enough to sterilize, cheap enough to be practical, and let's be honest, it keeps morale suspiciously high. You've watched even the grumpiest sailor loosen up after a ration, his shoulders unclenching as the sea's endless horizon feels a little less bleak. Of course, it's not always rum. In colder waters, ale or small beer might take its place, though they're bulkier to store and don't last quite as well. On some ships, brandy is the preservative of choice, but that's usually for captains with a taste for the finer things or ones who just plundered a French merchant vessel. Whatever the spirit, the principle is the same. A little alcohol buys you more time before the water turns. You've even heard tales of captains who enforced strict dilution ratios, making sure the crew didn't drain the casks dry before the next port. A heavy hand with the rum meant merrier evenings, but thirstier days later, and thirst is a harder enemy than boredom. On your own ship, the mix is modest enough to do the job, not so much that the lookout starts seeing two horizons instead of one. The ritual is almost comforting. Fill the cask with water, add the spirit, seal it tight, and mark it with chalk so everyone knows it's safe. When the days get long and the sun too bright, you can dip a ladle in and take a drink that tastes faintly of sugarcane and fire, knowing it won't put you in the sick bay. It's a small luxury that feels like more than it is. And rum being rum pulls double duty. It's the centerpiece of toasts after a successful raid, the ingredient in makeshift medicinal remedies, and the occasional bribe for cooperation when tempers fray. You've seen it turn tense negotiations on a beach into rowdy laughter around a driftwood fire. You've also seen it make fools of good sailors, which is why, like all things valuable at sea, it's rationed with care. As you watch the crew finish sealing the cask, you notice a group gathered near the bow, talking in low voices. You recognize the signs a landing party being chosen. A foraging trip is in the works, and while the preserved food will keep you alive, nothing lifts spirits like something fresh pulled straight from the land. You make your way toward the bow, where the small group is already sorting out who will go ashore. There's an unspoken buzz whenever the ship drops anchor off a quiet, unclaimed shore. This isn't a raid, not unless you count chasing wild chickens. But it's still an adventure of sorts. Foraging is the polite word for it. In pirate terms, it's more of an opportunistic grocery run with the possibility of sprinting back to the boat if anyone notices. The landing party is a mix of quick feet and sharp eyes. You're looking for people who can spot edible plants, climb for coconuts, and ideally not trip over roots while carrying a squawking bird under one arm. You grab a small sack, a knife, and a water flask, essentials for any shore excursion. The cook hands you a mental list. Fresh herbs, if you can find them, leafy greens, anything that can add life to the salted and pickled stores. And no bringing back anything that bites, he warns, though you both know that's more of a guideline than a rule. Stepping off the longboat, the sand feels strange after weeks of planks underfoot. The air here is heavier, scented with earth and flowers instead of salt and tar. You move inland, keeping an eye out for signs of wild fruit. Low-hanging branches offer up clusters of bananas, still green but promising, while a nearby grove hides papayas, their orange flesh, a rare sweetness worth the climb. The trick is to take only what you can carry and move quickly. Too much loitering invites trouble, whether from curious locals or less welcome predators. Herbs are harder to spot, but one of the younger crew surprises you by recognizing wild thyme from his grandmother's garden back home. It's a small bundle, but when you imagine it stirred into a stew, the ship's galley seems a little less grim. Someone else spots a tangle of wild onions, their sharp scent cutting through the humid air as you dig them out. Every small find is a victory. Not all foraging is polite. In one quiet fishing village years ago, you remember borrowing a few chickens and a basket of eggs while the owner's back was turned. You justified it as necessity, but you still remember the indignant squawk that followed you all the way to the beach. Sometimes you trade a bit of cloth, a knife, a few coins, but pirates are not known for their patience with formal transactions when the longboat is waiting. There's also the hunt for game. Rabbits, goats, or even the occasional boar if you're feeling brave and foolhardy. Meat this fresh is a rare treat on board, though the logistics of carrying a goat back to the boat without both of you falling in the water are less than glamorous. Still, the risk feels worth it when you imagine the smell of roasting meat replacing the ever-present tang of salt pork. Back near the shore, a couple of crewmen wade into the shallows, flipping over rocks in search of crabs and shellfish. Mussels and clams are a gamble delicious when fresh but dangerous if you pick them in the wrong place. You've learned to watch for clear water and avoid anything that smells even faintly wrong. A bad shellfish can take down a sailor faster than a musket ball, and without the heroic ballad to go with it. By the time you return to the longboat, the sacks are heavy and the crew is flushed with the satisfaction of a good haul. Coconuts clunk together in the bottom, herbs are wrapped in leaves to keep them from wilting, and somewhere in the mix is a bewildered chicken tied by the legs glaring at everyone in turn. The row back to the ship is slower, the boat riding lower in the water with the weight of your spoils. As you climb the ladder back on deck, you spot the cook, waiting arms crossed, but eyes already measuring the bounty. He'll stretch these fresh finds into meals that break the monotony for a few days. And when the freshness fades, there's always another trick, one that doesn't restore the food, but at least makes it seem like it hasn't been sailing with you for weeks. The cook eyes the heap of goods with a calculating squint, already thinking about which dishes will get the rare honor of fresh ingredients. But as you know, once the bananas are gone and the herbs have wilted, you're back to the preserved staples, and sometimes those staples need a bit of disguise. That's where spices come in. Not the polite sprinkle of flavor you might use at a tavern table, but bold, almost defiant doses meant to shout over whatever questionable smells might be rising from the pot. You follow the cook into the galley, ducking under low beams. A small chest sits tucked into a corner, its lid latched not for security, but for safety. These spices are worth more than their weight in coin out here. He opens it, and the air shifts, instantly the warmth of cinnamon, the sharp bite of pepper, the dark, almost smoky scent of cloves. These are prizes from past raids lifted from merchant ships that never saw their cargo reach its intended port. Each jar or packet is like a miniature port of call, the scent carrying you halfway across the world. Pepper is the workhorse ground generously into stews to give the illusion of heat and freshness. A pinch of nutmeg can make dried meat taste almost civilized, while cinnamon can turn a pot of lumpy porridge into something that reminds you of better mornings. You've even seen cardamom seeds tucked into casks of rice, their perfume subtly infusing every grain. Out here, the right spice can be the difference between a crew who tolerates their food and one who starts grumbling loud enough for the captain to notice. Of course, there's the less glamorous reason for these spices masking the scent of meat that's past its prime. Salt keeps it safe to eat, technically, but the nose doesn't always agree with the tongue. You've had meals where the pepper was so thick it formed a second crust, and everyone pretended not to notice why. It's a game pirates have played for centuries, making the best of what you have, even if what you have is a bit suspect. You think about how spices have started wars and built empires. The same cloves you're sprinkling into a pot once sailed under guard on Portuguese caravels, each pound fought over in the courts of Europe. Now here they are, rattling in a tin can on a pirate ship, their grand history reduced to keeping the crew from complaining about dinner. There's a strange poetry in that. A new recruit wanders in, sniffing the air like a curious cat. He leans over the simmering pot, and the cook smacks his hand away before he can lift the lid. "Not ready yet," comes the gruff reply, though you know the real reason the cook doesn't want anyone seeing the raw form of what will soon be tonight's stew. The transformation is part culinary skill, part sleight of hand, and a dash of stubborn hope. On shore, in the great markets of places like Port Royal or Havana, spice merchants would boast of their wares as luxuries for the wealthy. Out here, they're survival tools. The same peppercorns that would garnish a nobleman's roast in Spain are now working to convince a pirate that the chunk of meat in his bowl is definitely fine to eat. And somehow, more often than not, it works. The cook gives the pot a final stir, the scent rising in a cloud that almost makes you forget the galley's cramped heat. He ladles out portions each bowl, carrying that layered aroma of distant lands and clever trickery. As the crew eats, the mood lifts. No one talks about how old the meat is or when the fish was last caught. Instead, there are jokes, a bit of singing, and the easy rhythm of full bellies. It's a temporary reprieve, of course. You know the day will come when even the spices can't distract from the reality of dwindling stores. That's when the true art of a pirate cook comes into play, taking the scraps and the odds and ends and turning them into something that still feels like a meal. The last days before landfall have a certain tension to them, not the dramatic kind of a looming battle, but the quieter strain of watching the stores shrink. You can see it in the galley barrels scraped down to the last layer of salt pickle brine, cloudy from too many hands fishing around inside, and sacks of biscuit with more dust than actual biscuits left in them. This is when preservation becomes less about keeping food from spoiling and more about stretching what's left so it still feels like something worth eating. You watch the cook make his rounds, eyeing the corners of the hold like a scavenger bird. He finds a hunk of cheese that's grown a generous coat of mold, but instead of tossing it, he pulls a knife and shaves away the outer layer until the pale, firm heart is revealed. A loaf of bread, if you can still call it that, gets the same treatment. The blue-green patches cut clean before it's sliced and toasted over a small flame to mask any lingering doubt. It's not wasteful. It's survival by subtraction. Some things get repurposed entirely. That last cup of dried peas, too few for a proper stew, gets mashed into a paste with oil and a handful of spices, then spread over hardtack to make it seem deliberate. The crumbs at the bottom of the biscuit sack are saved for thickening soups, and any lingering pickle brine might find its way into a pot to give a tang where freshness is long gone. Every scrap has a destination, and nothing is beneath consideration if it can fill a stomach. You've seen crews in this stage start to get creative in ways that feel almost luxurious. A spoonful of sugar stirred into watered-down rum becomes a treat. The rind from a lemon, long after the juice has been squeezed into someone's cup, gets candied in leftover syrup and passed around like a prize. It's part morale, part illusion, but it works. The human mind is strangely willing to believe that something is special if it's rare enough. Of course, there are the failures too. You remember one desperate cook trying to rehydrate salted fish that had been forgotten in the corner of the hold for far too long. It came back to life in the pot, yes, but in a way that had the entire crew eating hardtack plain that night. Sometimes knowing when not to serve something is as important as stretching what you have. It's in these moments that the ingenuity of sailors, pirate or otherwise, shines brightest. They can turn the ragged end of a voyage into something bearable, if not bountiful. You think of merchant crews in the East Indies, boiling rice with coconut husks for flavor when the real coconut was long gone. Or whalers in the Pacific, making coffee from scorched biscuit crumbs steeped in hot water, pretending the bitter brew was more than it was. It's all theater in the end, but theater can keep spirits afloat. On deck, the crew eats in a subdued sort of peace, each man and woman knowing there's just enough left to see you through. Somewhere in the distance, you imagine the outline of the next port with its noisy markets and the smell of real bread baking in stone ovens. But for now, you break your biscuit in half, dunk it into the last of your stew, and take a bite that's more texture than taste. You can't help but smirk. For all the myths about pirate life, this right here is the truest part, making the most out of whatever's left and calling it dinner. Out here on the open sea, survival was never just about sails and cannons. It was about salted barrels, sun-dried strips, jars of vinegar, and the stubborn crunch of hardtack. Pirates learned that keeping a crew alive meant mastering the quiet art of preservation, turning whatever the shore offered into provisions that could outlast storms and doldrums alike. Each cask, each spice, each wedge of citrus was a lifeline disguised as food. Now, as the waves rock gently beneath you, imagine the deck swaying under your feet, the scent of brine and wood in the air, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the stores will last just long enough to see land again. Let that rhythm carry you steady, patient and sure, until your thoughts drift like a ship on calm waters. Close your eyes and let the ocean keep watch while you rest.